Welcome to the second day of the September Summit towards an Institute of Black Studies hosted by the Musée du quai Branly in Paris. My name is Adwan Nasser, and I will be moderating today's lecture by Professor Maboula Soumahoro, Speaking Black in French, or Parole Noire, Noire Parole, as part of Saison Africa 2020's The September Summit. Professor Achille Mbembe's inaugural lecture from last night, which invited us to decenter our imaginaries from the dying old world and tune into post-colonial geographies of resilience, is now archived and accessible to the public by the museum's YouTube channel. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to inform our viewers that this panel will be conducted in French. Simultaneous translation into English is available by changing the YouTube stream selection. We encourage you to share your comments and questions in the YouTube chat during and after the lecture. We will then share those with our panelists and speakers during the discussion. On that note, I'm honored to be introducing Professor Maboula Soumahoro today. Dr. Soumahoro is an associate professor in the English department of the University of Tours, France, where she also received her PhD. A specialist in the field of Africana studies, she has conducted research and taught in several universities and prisons in the United States and France. Bennington College, Columbia University, New York and Paris, Barnard College, Bard Prison Initiative, Bayview Correctional Facility, Stanford University in Paris, Sciences Po, the prisons in Bois d'Arcy, Villepinte, and Fresnes. From 2013 to 2017, she served as a member of the National Committee for the Memory and History of Slavery. Since 2013, she is also the president of the Black History Month, an organization dedicated to the celebration of Black history and cultures throughout the world. She is the author of Le Triangle et l'Hexagone, Réflexions sur une identité noire, published by La Découverte. The English translation is forthcoming with Polity Press in 2021. Titled Black is the Journey, Africana the Name, it will feature a foreword by Professor Sadia Hartman. And while many across the Francophone sphere have already engaged with this groundbreaking book, I thought I would read out an excerpt in French to encourage our audience to purchase a copy or look out for the English translation, out soon. Le Triangle et l'Hexagone est un ouvrage hybride. Le récit autobiographique d'une chercheuse.
Le Triangle et l'Hexagone is a hybrid work. It's an autobiographical writing of a researcher. The author is entering into dialogue between small and large history, but also intellectual, artistic, and political tradition of Black African diaspora. What kind of meaning can we give to the body, history, the arts, or politics? Through this right work, Maboula Soumahoro is sharing her point of view on life, her transatlantic journeys in Côte d'Ivoire, where her origins are, France, the US, and her most revealing experiences in order to think about her identity as a Black woman at the beginning of the 19th century. She had to overcome many obstacles within the French university, and this individual experience echoes collective experience, highlighting the normalization of racism today in France, both in the personal, professional, intellectual, and mediatic realms. Violence is present at each step, and it can be explicit. How can we talk about it, describe it? Good afternoon. I would like to thank Sarah Rifki and Edwin Nasser for this invite. I'm honored, and I'd like to thank quai Branly as well for organizing this event and the Saison Africa 2020. Thank you to Alienor as well and the technical team. Before starting this presentation, it would be twofold. I'd like to explain my choice, the choice I made to speak French today, and I would like to apologize to the English-speaking people here. I decided to speak French today because we are in France today, in the Hexagon, in the capital of France, French-speaking capital of France, and at the Quai Branly, Museum Quai Branly. In 2004, a conference took place in Paris focusing on African diaspora. It was organized by University Paris 7 and was the initiative of Geneviève Fabre. I will tell you more about it. And during the inauguration of this conference, Maryse Condé, French Guadeloupean writer, started her speech in French, insisting on the necessity of multiple languages in the African diaspora. English was too predominant in this diaspora, and Maryse Condé and others were part of the French-speaking part of it. With all my respect for Maryse Condé, I also wanted to make the choice of speaking French so that I could pronunciate, articulate different themes, issues, which are still issues today in the hexagonal France. So it's my choice to speak in French. I do speak English as well. I'd like to start with some thoughts on this concept of Black Studies, which is the title of this cycle of conferences, the Institute of Black Studies. So I'd like to share an intellectual, scientific thought on Black Studies, how necessary these Black Studies are in France and hexagonal France. And the second part of my speech will be on the introduction of my work, Le Triangle et l'Hexagone, Réflexion sur une identité noire. And I think that by reading the introduction of my book, I will be able to explain the context better of what I'm about to share with you. So the meaning of Black Studies in the US and in France, a comparative social history of a university field from 1970 to 2018. In the US, the term Black Studies means different things. Africana studies, Pan-African studies, African-American studies. Regardless of the terms, the rise of this academic field goes back to the end of the 60s. This what gave birth to the radical movement of Black Power and is characterized by a strong political uprising. It will then provoke major changes at the legal level. And in this context, Black Studies appear. They are systematically studying the history, culture, and experience of Black community at university. This is a quote from French researcher Caroline Roland-Diamond. The rise of Black Studies in the US can be apprehended as the will of intellectuals, students, artists, activists, and Afro-American academics that are committed here to apply to the university field, academic field, the rise of these issues. The creation and making those studies and described in the long term can be also at the political level. Studies for equality, justice are also now part of academic institutions. They are going to transform them by creating new academic studies, programs, curricula, certificates, diplomas. Several researchers have already published works on this history. By choosing the point of view of socio-history, it allows an empirical study by consulting archives, studying power balance and links between power and individuals within a same society. If Black studies don't exist as such in France, we can notice the existence of a research field dedicated to the history and culture of African American society. Some researchers are pioneers in African American studies. From the 1970s, the Center for Afro-American Studies was founded, and new literatures in English from the University Paris 3rd, Sorbonne Nouvelle, and then Paris 7. This center, for a long time, published a bi-yearly a review called Afram Review, published by Michel Fabre. This review was a literary critique allowing scientific production of studies, Afro-American studies. When those researchers, Genevieve and Michel Fabre, retired at the beginning of the 2000s, the activities of this Center for African American Studies then was transferred to the University of Tours with the creation of a young Afro-American study team directed by Claudine Renaud in 2004. Those French Black studies, created from the 1970s, are a real research field. Pioneers such as Michel Fabre, Genevieve Fabre, Claudine Renaud, those personalities, pioneers, and their colleagues have taught within many French universities and other higher studies centers. They taught in English, and they were directing thesis, PhD studies. They organize conferences, study days, they publish articles, monographies, collective articles. They also translated African American books into French. They invited foreign teachers, experts in their specific field. These pioneers produced knowledge, trained students who themselves then started working with universities. This foundation of African American studies, when we cross it with transatlantic studies, are asking several questions. What is the role played by those players? What is the context, political context of hexagonal France? Making those studies part of a long-term cycle, it seems that they are still at the margin of specialities that are part of section number 11 of the National Council of Universities. This section 11 exists under the title Language and English Literature, or English-speaking language. African American studies in France are not born within political and social demands of their founders. There is no concrete link between those studies and the external population, the population external to the academic field. Generally speaking, this can be found through literature and arts. The majority of researchers and teachers, experts in African American studies, are neither American nor African American. African American studies in France, when born from uprisings or rebellions from students that were activists, those studies don't aim at a reflection of history, of the aspiration of a certain category of the French hexagonal population. Those genesis make us ask each other different questions. Yes, France is a European power, a former imperial and colonial power, that is part of the transatlantic triangle that Paul Gilroy called the Black Atlantic. Means that populations that were identified by history as black are present in French territory. Those populations that are scattered from one side to the other of the Atlantic were at the heart of academic research and the research on African diaspora and their descent. This theoretical approach acknowledges the existence of black populations in France, both in the hexagonal space and in the overseas territories, whether it is a former or a current territory. These populations on the hexagonal territories are at the heart of my research. I think that from those studies and thanks to those researchers, we can see for the past decades a new approach of black studies. They focus on those populations and establish a direct link with social political evolutions. It very often aims at repairing, correct or even define a certain new organization of the current French society. In many cases, the people part of these movements are coming from Black African American studies. This is what leads us to the last step of my introduction, to question the rise of a new field of studies in France that is focusing on the Black French issue. If we start with the book of Black, Pop and Die, published in 2008, Blackness, and taking into account political uprisings in 2005, we might wonder if the emergence of French Black studies can be observed. This study could be carried out in a social, historical perspective with the new players of this academic field, whether they're French or foreign. This can be done through consulting university archives, the topic of curriculum, programs of conferences, program of seminars, thesis as well from PhD studies. The aim would be to answer one question: how can we define the context of this rise of Black studies, taking into account the context of the US and taking into account a larger field of study of the Black diaspora? We would be studying the relation to scientific reports, Black identity, that is characterizing traditional French studies. What is the impact of recent demographic, social, cultural, political evolutions within the French Republic on this type of knowledge? We might wonder then, what is the reciprocal influence of a new type of knowledge and social and political experiences? So these are some thoughts that I wanted to share with you on the necessity, the urgency of Black studies in France. Second part of my presentation, as I said, is about the introduction of my book, Le Triangle et l'Hexagone, The Triangle and the Hexagon. I will try sharing a personal, scientific, intellectual point of view, and I will try to give a voice to this Black French hexagonal context. And just a minute, I will drink a sip of water. This introduction is entitled Parole Noire, Noire Parole. I'm Black with 7K. I'm speaking Black in French, and my introduction is quoting a singer and his song who said, "I'm Black with 7K." I'm the daughter of the Hexagon and the Atlantic. My descent, my origins, my journey, and my own history are part of a cultural, political, and intellectual immensity of Black Atlantic, a geographical space that is deeply shaped by history. This triangular space has put in relation in a unique way 3 continents: Europe, Africa, and the Americas. It takes into account Côte d'Ivoire and the Africa of my parents, but as well the Hexagon where I was born and my where I currently live. I take into account smaller but a larger story, and take into account the artistic, political, and intellectual tradition of Black African diaspora. What is this diaspora? It's important to define a framework to define what we are talking about. Words, terms have a meaning, and sometimes we need to go back to its original definition to understand what we're talking about. Regarding African population scattered around the world. We're talking about diaspora, usually described as Black or African, depending on the type of perspective that we're choosing. If we're talking about a Black diaspora, we're putting at the heart of these concerns the color of the skin. The Black body is construction, its meaning, since the Western Europe and African continent are now part of modern history. If it took place in a simultaneous way, it wasn't done equally. Here I'm talking about the Western Europe colonial project that emerged at the end of the 15th century, that conquered and subjected population. It was judged as barbaric and was only radical. These populations might have been already on site, such as the Amerindian populations, or might have been transferred to those new continents. And in this backdrop, history, culture, religion, education, law shaped Black lives, Black bodies within a society that were highly with a large hierarchy. The Black and Black life we should understand what Black diaspora when we want to insist on the color of the skin, the weight of social construction, political and cultural constructions. Here we're not talking about biology, but we are talking about a construction, a fabrication. When we're talking about African diaspora, we're insisting on Africa as a continent, but also on a starting point. Africa is at the heart of identity concerns.
Dans une perspective pan-africaine, le sort de la diaspora est intimement lié à...
In a pan-African diaspora, to be far from the original continent, denying it serves no purpose. The brand of Africa is engraved in bodies. The culture and the history of Africans and their descendants will have to deal with that because the world has to deal with it.
Because the world is made of it. If we talk about diaspora, we're talking about dispersion, scattering.
And globalization, but talking about diaspora is also equal to talking about connections and reconnections of mixtures, of inventions, of creativity, the strategies for resistance.
And resistance.
Je reprends. Effectivement.
So indeed, the whole idea of diaspora, as it was applied to Israel, the Jewish people, implies an idea of dispersion, which led to a catastrophe.
It's the idea of a discussion, a catastrophe. We know this catastrophe.
Origin of the dispersion of the Bambara, the Peul, the Wolof, the Igbo, the Yoruba.
But other type of ethnic groups.
Illegal commerce of human beings, only all coming from Africa.
Coming from the African continent. Those people were then displaced,
or being massively passed on to Americas.
To replace
Indian populations that have been decimated or disappeared. In that the world, by Europeans, the abundance of land had to be exploited to a maximum extent.
New lands needed to be exploited. A large type of wealth should be exploited and benefit to companies, to whole nations. Here we are talking about 12 million of African people that were displaced in this triangle trade taking place on 3 continents in a deeply violent way, Europe, Africa, and the Americas.
Ne prend pas en compte les individus ayant trouvé la mort lors des razzias menées à l'intérieur des terres.
These figures do not take into account the number of deaths where slaves had to wait to then be displaced in large boats to the Americas. How can we count the number of people that were affected directly or indirectly by this slave trade? If slavery has been a tradition in many
l'esclavage colonial est le seul qui est inscrit dans les corps d'un nouvel ordre sociopolitique. C'est cet ordre que révèlent les identités noires et blanches, créées
It's this new order
et en opposition maximale.
that is in maximal opposition. Now that we have defined the framework, let's study how those people who were considered as inferiors and then sent to societies founded on inequality. We know that all type of domination, all type of system, whether they are inferiors or it's dehumanized, all type of domination is inevitably going to have to face strategies of resistance that are going to put in place by the populations that are the most marginalized, affected by such a system. This resistance has always existed and can be deployed directly or indirectly. This is a radical affirmation of the humanity of this population.
Cette contestation est une revendication implacable d'égalité. Ces résistances et contestations jalonnent l'histoire de l'ensemble de la diaspora.
Resistance, contestations are also including the African continent itself, whether we are defying the Queen Jinga that's facing Portuguese authorities, whether it's the echo of Colonel Degres at the Maboula Fort in Guadeloupe, heard by all Black Americans, whether it's about the slavery of Saint-Domingue, a new type of republic that just for one moment gave birth to the universal, so-called universal ideas of French Revolution.
Des deux victoires de l'Éthiopie impériale face aux assauts colonialistes de l'Italie, du réveil Rasta de la Jamaïque qui a produit
Réveil Rasta of Jamaica that produced gay music with the international success continues to remind us the importance of the anchored truth. In addition, there are Martinique sisters, Paulette and Jane Nadal, who graduated from the Sorbonne and who are translating that posed the first initiatives of the monumental movement of the negritude to bloom. And there's also a Martiniquez psychiatrist that joined the anti-colonial group and the victory of that Algeria facing an arrogant France and in denial. Dien Ben Phu, a coordination of women that knew they were black and an anti-racist march crossing France from one end to the X in 1983. The rap texts in French language, including one in particular, describe France as a land where the Negroes won't heat it up. The documentaries that try to show tenderness where we suppose they're absent or to open the way, projecting Black Marias on white screens, and acts of resistance were uninterrupted. The next section was entitled, What is this game? Or what is this I? I have to keep it simple, starting with an attempt to respond to the existential question, who am I? To follow a development devoted to the way in which I'm situated within the French nation and the world, given a fecund history that fashioned societies, spirits, and bodies. The issue is that of my ability to express myself in French in the most exact way possible to define and describe the space that we're interested in, the Atlantic world and the French world. The difficulties are legion, and they can appear to be insurmountable. I only have one language, and it's not mine. So this quote from Beriba is the title chosen from the French sociologist Kauta Hachi for his assessment of the 5 Algerian writers who decided to write in French. Now, in this essay, Hachi explores the bond between literature and politics. This title is interesting, above and beyond the colonial issue. The question also is raised in the post-colonial period. I only have one language, and it's not mine. This question of language, I ask myself that question as well. And being born in Paris, from parents having migrated into France from the Côte d'Ivoire in the 60s, my main language, the one I use, and that I practice the most, the one I know the best, is indeed French. I should be able to describe that French language as mine, my maternal mother tongue, my first or natural language. But this is not the case. The French language is not my mother tongue. It is not the first language I spoke in, and it's not my natural language. On the contrary, for me, the French language is a language that I learned very young. And in this respect, it's not a language that was transmitted to me naturally by my family and through my mother, because French is not the language of my mother. It's for that reason that it's difficult for me to identify very clearly what my mother tongue is. I use the adjective here as a mother in its first meaning, because I'm talking about a language that is not the language of my mother that I practiced since I was little. It is that of a country which is not always mine. It's a language of a country, it's a language that's dispensed throughout the world, of a dominant country. And I have one of the fruits of that history, of this fact. Between my mother and France, there is a history. Between my mother and myself, there is a history. Between the French language and myself, there's also a history. An old history, both rich and complex, international, splendid and painful, silent, forgotten, or just denied. Nonetheless, I exist, and France is not my mother. So French is not my mother tongue, but I am still French, and I speak that language. And that is the language that I know and have possessed the best. But the French language is a problem for me, first of all, because it's not totally mine. And then because it doesn't make it possible to express everything. I can't express everything I would like to say. In the silence of the French language, I find the heavy silence that exists sometimes between my mother and myself when we talk in French. It is this silence that exists between us would be less frequent, I'm certain, if I could express myself in Jula. Jula is my mother's language. That Jula language does not belong to me either. I don't speak my mother's language. I speak a language that is not my mother's. What does this mean for me? What is the impact in what I can say, about what I can allow myself to say, and what I can succeed in fully expressing or not? So the solution to this situation and these incessant questions is that I speak English, which makes it possible to have a distance. The English language doesn't belong to me. It owes me nothing, and neither do I. It would be so much simpler. I love that language. As soon as even when I was young, I learned it, and I learned it year after year, and I wound up mastering it after many efforts and many years of study. The English language was so practical for me. It contains no emotional connotation that you have in French or in Jula. In English, I'm free. I can express myself without obstacle, and I can reinvent myself. But doing this, I'm creating new silences between France, the Côte d'Ivoire, and myself. It's so hard for me to express myself on topics that are being dealt with through this work in French and from France. This being said, that is exactly that difficulty that I wish to be able to sound the depths of, which requires an affirmation of my individuality taken in an immense whole. So I need to dare say je in French, which means I. So using that pronoun, je, basing this on the magic of exemption, which overpasses all of the normal injunctions. When I talk about emancipation and freedom, the aware usage of the word je, or I, means that I can assume my own individuality fully and not respect recommendations, the many recommendations, very serious recommendations concerning the critical distance that one would have to maintain at all costs. In this respect, I renounce that so-called critical distance and the illusion of this objectivity, while still leaving aside the accusations of non-rationality and inability to reason and analyze. The pronoun je, if you're a researcher, is to absolutely not be used. The person, the individual, has to erase oneself totally and leave room to pure exclusion, to be totally detached and disinterested and disincarnate. It is the last point that I'd like to pose a question about, because my I is that of a black woman who evolved between the greater France and the other parts of the Atlantic Triangle. And for this reason, my body cannot be erased from this equation. How could it be otherwise? The spaces that we're talking about here are the spaces that designed this body, which is mine. And that whatever the place is perceived as black. And it is that perception has concrete consequences that themselves are in direct contradiction with the idea of critical distance. The distance is impossible for me. I don't even want the distance. I'd rather have the point of view and the approach and the analysis that is situated, because in truth, all of us, personally, I simply don't have the leisure to disincarnate myself and think fully in a detached way the world, society, and populations. It is that utilization of the pronoun I requires a kind of courage and audacity, a courage and audacity to dare, finally, to say I, when you lean to your own family or to your own life, your personal trajectory, and in this fact, to have interact what comes from scientific research and what comes from the personal sphere or even intimate sphere. The courage and audacity I'm speaking about here are acting such a way in a French university context and in French, because I'm talking about a trajectory and ascendance which make me part of a history and context and a geographical desert which plunges us inevitably and irremediably in a French history, in a precise French history, that of the imperialist or colonial history of France, that of a France that is racialized and racializing, and of a France that is current, and as a post-colonial republic could easily be admitted, on the contrary, of its neo-colonial status, which still lasts, which still continues. So it is all of these factors that I titled the triangle and the hexagon. The title came from that. And for me, it's a matter of drafting and publishing and saying and assuming in France and in French, because for a long time it was easier for me and more practical for me to do my thinking about African diaspora outside of France and in English. Indeed, from other spaces, which were also located in the Atlantic era, mainly in the US, but also in the Caribbean, the English-speaking Caribbean. For a long time I felt freer, less paralyzed at the idea of thinking and formulating my ideas, developing them and writing them in this project. The feeling of freedom came from a university studies with salvation, meetings that were a salvation. In this respect, I should mention the centrality of courses by Edouard Glissant or Marie Scondé, who had never received a title in the French university. Both of them had great university careers in the US. I realize today that this freedom are in fact intimately linked to the deafening silence imposed by France and the impossibility or the illegality of saying and naming and thinking and sounding the questions and subjects that anger people even again today. These questions and themes are nonetheless tightly linked to the major history that transformed the Atlantic space and the rest of the world since the end of the 15th century. So this big history had produced the globalization that we continue to evolve in. In this kind of context, so both are intermingled in politics. So of African descendants, but black in France at the end of the 20th century, my history and my path de facto are part of a history whose geography is much more vast than my own person. This being said, this story and these geographies weigh heavily on my own life. So in exploring them and studying them, I'm also exploring and studying myself. So I actually comprise my own object of study. So the question that arises is to know, what do I do with this state of affairs? In what way should I position myself? I believe that the response involves a coming out, either what the studies on gender define as the prior indispensable condition, starting at which the individual is located politically and fully assumed within the society they evolve in. I am a French black woman. That's part of my identity, and it cannot be made invisible, neither for society, nor for research in France. This black identity, because it is fundamentally political in the sense that it arises from a huge amount of historical processes, has obviously there's been a lot of intellectual, political, religious, and cultural, economic, and social considerations, and for many centuries, precisely since the modern era that I spoke about earlier. But above and beyond everything I just mentioned, this black identity has implications as well as consequences. I was born in Paris from Jula parents, so they were Muslim, who left the Côte d'Ivoire and former French colony in the 60s. The reasons that pushed my parents to leave their country of birth were both banal and similar to the reasons of many populations that are arriving still today in France, and that public opinion and media have renamed refugees and immigrants. These reasons include seeking a better life through obtaining diplomas and a good job. I grew up in France, where I subsequently entered into university studies that I quickly continued in the US for more than 10 years. Over there, I became fully aware of the Atlantic space and the historical diaspora in which my body made me part. Now, in this city world, which is New York, in the contact with African American populations, African Caribbean, African Latina, African or Afro-Europeans, that my black identity is transnational, it's diasporic, and that's where it was forged, in all freedom and serenely. It's in the US that the responses were given to me. It's in the United States and then the Caribbean that I declared that I was French and that one believed me. It's from the US that I had a different way of looking at Côte d'Ivoire and Africa. You shouldn't think that for me it's, drawing an idyllic portrait of America in general. That idea is far from my idea. This country and its story and this continent has taught us that nothing is idyllic. This being said, America are the place of the scene of the original crime, and societies that were elaborated there bring into presence all of the populations having played a role in that modern history. All of the racial identities and social are there that were fabricated by history, whether they be dominated or dominant. In that respect, you can avoid nothing. You can't even think of avoiding things. And so the case of France appears to be quite different, with its dichotomy which separates the France from its numerous so-called overseas territories, whether they be current or former. I grew up in France, in a Jula family which was very traditional, considered that France was only a place to live in, temporarily. And I was raised in the myth of the return, which, despised how specific it was linked to the epoch in the French context. It seemed like many projects to return to Africa, which were developed by other African families in the US that were violently dispersed in the slave trade, in the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. I need to add to this that this myth of the return was not the only fact due to my parents. It was sustained by the Republic, which during the period that followed the oil shock in '73, which put an end to the 30 glorious years in France, they were hoping for the departure of those that had been perceived as being foreign workers, foreigners who were only in France for temporarily. Not immigrants, not workers from 70 to 1990. I should never have been concerned by this myth of the eternal myth of return. This was expressed by my parents and by the Republic, but these two agreed on one point, that I was not French. In addition to that, it's true that I am not born French. It's only at the end of the 90s that I obtained my first national identity card. They were talking about my rights to the French nationality. By the voice of the administration said, the reintegration. This administrative jargon refers to the fact that my parents were born in Côte d'Ivoire at a time when the country was still part of the colonial French Empire. This factor, added to the fact that I was born and had grown up in France, gave me the right to pretend to have pretensions to French nationality. So I could be reintegrated. I could thus be reintegrated to the French nation as though a former order, or even natural order, could at last be reestablished, as though the independence of the Côte d'Ivoire was only a parenthesis. But maybe, perhaps more importantly, this geopolitical consideration supplied, in my way of thinking, a concrete example of the construction of an identity, because my access to French citizenship is anchored in colonial history of France. In my precise case, and this is true for many other people, the personal is political. Insofar as the way in which I was treated in France during my childhood, I can say that it really varied considerably depending on the vision that France had about race and the phenotype, the color of the skin, the names and first names, the religion, the social belonging, and the nationality. In this French space, I was perceived sometimes black, sometimes African, and sometimes Ivorian. But my name and family name were exotic. Islam is a religion that received from my parents seemed to be at the antipodes of Christianity, atheism, and laicity. It seemed to me that black and Muslim identities are mutually exclusive, as though you could not be both at the same time. As a black and Muslim woman, and I don't wear a veil, I never was considered as a Muslim in the public French space. Declaring myself as such, it woke up many concerns. Islam helped me to draw bonds with other African communities that originated from both sides of the Sahara. And to conclude, the whole story of social classes has also played a role, because as a poor family, we lived in an HLM, in low-cost housing, and we had the rights to social aids. And other immigrant families, similar to other immigrant families that recently have been installed in France, I'm talking about Italians, Polish, Yugoslavians, Spanish, Portuguese, Algerians, Moroccans, Tunisians, Haitians, Indians, Vietnamese, Senegalese, Malian, Congolese, or Cameroonese. And you could also add some white French families, or others that came from the overseas departments. So strangely, we all live in the same type of place. And up to a certain point, our experiences were the same, but only up to a certain point. In 2016, a case of police violence I found striking. We're talking about the arrest of the Jean Théo Roulouaka, which occurred in Aulnay-sous-Bois in the Seine-Saint-Denis department. The fatal meeting of the young man with the municipal police led, first of all, to a hospitalization urgently because he was injured in an obscene way and which is still not explained. Above and beyond this trite case of banal police brutality, there was also the media. During one of the televised debate which followed the violent arrest of this young person, we heard the representative of a trade union declare that if the police involved in this had called him a bamboula, as he said, the term, according to the trade unionists, would be okay. How could you not react to that? Why did the media say nothing about the origins of that expression, the specific character and the connotation and the insult of that insult? In this particular case, the fact of that insult is no longer a question of a simple case of police violence, but indeed a case of violence by the police of a racist nature. The Theo affair and the discussion around the word bamboula I found striking because my own name is Maboula. In the Jula language, the language of my parents, the feminine first name means she who opens the way, or she who shows the way. I have the name of my paternal, my aunt, who died shortly before I was born. In the eyes of my parents, and for many other people in the world, the idea is to help that name continue. Genealogy is based on repetition and naming. The Nuluaka affair sent me back to my French childhood, during which the sound resemblance between bamboula and mamboula made of me, in the eyes of French and foreigners, a black, the incarnation, unexpected incarnation of French savagery, because despite the imaginary fostered by this colonial period that are supposed to be further from, for most people, a doubt was installed. Maybe after all, this figure of bamboula was not real. It was a matter of an amusing phantasm, but maybe it wasn't real. This being said, this subtle doubt disappeared with respect to me. Myself, I incarnated very concretely and tangibly Africa and the black being, negritude and darkness. The myth became reality in my own body. The myth became reality starting from my own body, my own black body. It is my body and my phenotype that gave all of its weight and its meaning and its reality to the sonorous resemblance between those two words. There was no getting around it. And that's the way I understand it today, and that explains why the type of debate that I just described, whether it's intellectual or political, can sometimes resound in my body, in my flesh, in my psyche, and in my personal experience, and thus finish in my research. Because really, it's still a matter of getting to meaning. But the same first name and body wore different kinds of significance depending on where I was located geographically. So years after my birth, whether it be Bamboula or Dr. Maboul, the childhood game, human resources and the libraries that I was working in the university in New York, shared the admiration they had for my first name, that they found magnificent. In Jula, Maboula is a kind of unused these days. For other populations in Africa, it sounds authentically African. You could translate from the Arab language, you'd call la fun, even if some linguists might not agree. And since certain Arabic words went into French, the French language, because of centuries of exchange, both peaceful and violent, between these two peoples. In French, Maboul also exists, and if you believe our national dictionaries, it means a crazy person or a crazy woman. So through the Ethiopianist prism of Rastafari from Jamaica, Maboula made of me an African queen, would not honor de-race and of pre-originans. So we would forget Paris, which was the place of my birth, the Bushinengue, the French Guiana, called Maboula, a small, hairy animal that's cute and that we like to domesticate as a pet. And lastly, in Paris, in the amphitheater in the Sorbonne, during a local colloquium devoted to the diaspora, a specialist from Belgium and white talked about negritude, transformed my first name into Mamadou. So she even attacked my gender, deeply blinded by his appreciation of my body and my phenotype. Everywhere in the Atlantic, his vision and the understanding of my body and my person have not changed. So much for the autobiography. This matters because it makes it possible to situate oneself and to unveil one's perspective. It becomes mandatory because it makes it possible to drop the mask and to converse and exchange on the basis of truth and reality and in good faith. Universalism does not exist. I was born in France, and French is my mother tongue, without it being the tongue of my mother. Is France my mother? Is that why it's so hard to express things that are precisely linked to my real mother? In other terms, this linguistic well, talking about immigration, which echoes the history of displacement and migration, which really dated further back, is that have something to reveal about a vision of the world and global history that would both be incarnate in my black body, evolving in a society which is so-called blind to race. Is such a vision of the world make of me a black person in the heart of a society which is constitutionally blind to race? The problem is, nonetheless, that black and white identities are born at the same time in history. One never existed without the other. So, in guise of conclusion, I suggest a suggestion drawn from No Home in French, Homegoing in English, from Jacques, which illustrates the intention of the work that I propose. The young Ghanaian writer covers the historical period from the 18th century to current days. At the end of the novel, one of the characters, Marcus, in a gesture that the black American researcher, Livery Clark, called diasporic literacy, the fact of knowing how to read and figure out and write the diaspora in North Africa, started to write a thesis on history. Marcus Penn carried out his project successfully, but he was not able to find the words to describe it to his girlfriend Marjorie, and she was also a far-off relation. During the conversation about his thesis, Marcus starts to think, and I'm quoting, "How can you explain to Marjorie that what he wanted to capture with this project was the feeling of time, the impression to be a part of something that went so far back and that it was so vast that it was easy to forget that he and that all of us were part of that history, not in an isolated fashion, but fundamentally part." So I want to help the translator because I actually have it in English, so she's going to read it now in English.
Homegoing by Jacques. How could he explain to Marjorie that what he wanted to capture with this project was the feeling of time, of having been a part of something that stretched so far back, was so impossibly large that it was easy to forget that she and he and everyone else existed in it, not apart from it, but inside of it. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Le problème avec le soleil.
Maboula, merci infiniment pour cette intervention.
Thank you for this very generous, intimate, and inspiring talk. We have a couple of questions to ask you in English. You can answer in French if you like. I can answer in English if you like, whatever is easiest for you.
D'accord, super. So before we engage with the autobiographical nods that compose your intervention, I just wanted to perhaps start by unpacking the first half of your intervention, which had to do with the present conjuncture in France in regards to Black studies and the Macron government's current witch hunt against Black and decolonial studies. Mm-hmm. I think a question that a lot of academics the world over have been asking is, how come there's such an animosity within French academia towards Black and decolonial studies and accusations of it being sort of imposed by or imported from U.S. academia, when U.S. academia itself was sort of very much inspired by Francophone writing, be it the Négritude movement or the writings of Maryse Condé and Édouard Glissant? How would you explain this shift in conjuncture?
Thank you for this interesting question, but that is actually a very complex question. I'll begin with the last portion of your question. This understanding of US academia from France, from the French perspective, the hexagonal French perspective. I think that this French perspective of French academia is, to begin with, very incorrect, very wrong, because there is this idea of natural US academia that would be composed of US academics, when we know that within US academia, you find the whole world, and that many intellectuals and scholars have left their countries of origins to have a career in the United States. So when from France, we reject these theses, arguments, theories, or academic disciplines by labeling them US. I don't know what this US category is supposed to encompass, because we could use a lot of names. For instance, yesterday, Achille Bembe was one of your guests. And Achille Bembe is from Cameroon, teaches in South Africa, and also teaches in the United States at Duke University. So what does it mean? And if he publishes on the post-colony, are we going to say that this is some American thesis, Cameroonian thesis, South African thesis? It doesn't make any sense. So the same for anybody else, Spivak, or people from Latin America, people from the Caribbean, who happen to be based in the United States. So this labeling of American doesn't make real sense. I could myself go to the United States, spend a lot of time there, decide to get the US citizenship. Would that make me an American, and would that make me the product of US thinking? This is ridiculous. So this comes in in complement of what you just said about the influence of French and Francophone thinkers on US, real American thinkers and US institutions. So the circulation of ideas and the circulation of people and peoples, I should say, is obvious. So I don't know what France is. I don't know how France is perceiving the world. I really don't know how the country, or some part of the country, seems to be perceiving the world today. This is ridiculous. But I also wanted to say that the current witch hunt can also be approached in a little differing manner. What is happening today is that at times the president, or at times the secretary for higher education, have launched attacks against academia, but they're launching attacks against people who are already within academia. We are talking about professor, assistant, associate, or full professors. What about the people who never got to that level? The people who undertook PhDs on topics that are being denounced today, and who, even before, let's say, the higher sphere of politicians paid attention to that, were already rejected by the institution itself. What I have in mind here is the people that I've encountered and sometimes been to class with, who never finished their PhDs, who never got a tenured position, precisely because, I don't know, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, or 15 years ago even, their topics, their interest, their academic interest were deemed inappropriate, or were deemed not, academic enough, not serious enough, too political. So there is an irony for me to see that today people within academia are complaining about what the government is capable of doing, when these kind of attacks have been played out within academia, and nobody said anything. Nobody said anything. So it's interesting to watch from my perspective.
I have a follow-up question to that, which is sort of to ask sort of from the other side. I mean, there is sort of the question of how, like within this particular moment that is currently sort of manifesting in France, but also is definitely manifesting here as well in the US. I'm speaking from Boston. So the question of like, how practically do we involve, first of all, involve more people outside of the kind of immediate field, immediate sort of question of Black studies, like how do we sort of take that into other fields? And this is kind of part of the difficult work, I think, for us is to, and I'll be honest, no, there is this kind of question, like why, how do I come to this discourse, and how do I also sort of not just sort of like learn from it, but also integrate it within my own learning and my own work, as a sort of not just as an X or Y or Z, but again, within any kind of work that I'm doing, whoever I might be and wherever I might be coming from, regardless of the location. What kind of work needs to be done, and what kind of sort of solidarities need to be created? And I think to just kind of add to that, while you were sort of speaking, it was sort of reminding me very much of a lecture that I attended in 2010 with Abdel Fattah Kilito. And I remember being sort of very, it completely turned my life upside down a bit. But anyway, he was basically, it was very much, it just came out as a book. It was like, thou shalt not speak my language. It wasn't the translation one. And so this sort of, this question, yesterday in our introduction, I was thinking very much as Black studies as a language. And so this question of like, to whom does this language belong? And if this language is already divided, in what way can one, Kilito says like, one doesn't like it when somebody speaks our language and speaks it well. And so there is this kind of question of also, again, of situating oneself within a discourse as a language. And I guess to ask, how and where do we sort of meet each other within that language, and how do we kind of come to it sort of also transatlantically today?
Oh, Sarah, where do we meet and how? I think that the issue around, the issues around language is a real issue, and the matter of translation is a key matter. How do we connect? How do we communicate? How do we, further circulate, at least ideas is a matter of translation. It is a matter of, first, perhaps appropriation of, everybody's original languages, whatever they are. The fact that, the reflections on, I don't know, I've spoken French today. So am I French? Is it my native tongue? Is it not my native tongue? The fact is, in the reality, in the moment, and due to historical reasons, French is mine now, and I can do whatever I want with it, It's just a fact. It's not a... It's not a prize, it's not a reward, it's just a fact. And then if we're interested in this concept of diaspora, or if we're interested in this, in transnational Black studies, then we need to get in conversation with other sites, with other spaces where, large Black populations reside or where there are people who are interested in Black matters. And for that, we have to communicate, and we have to be able to communicate. There are certain issues that are being raised right now. It was about Edwin's first question. The controversy that is taking place in France today has to do with the recent publications, particularly during the 2010s, the recent publications of works that have come from the English-speaking world. So now people are talking about, post-colonial, decolonial intersectionality because, Gilroy, has been translated now. Bell Hooks has been translated now, which means that, in my view, we are having debates in France that are already outdated. Like we're talking about things that are supposed to be controversial when we know that the Black Atlantic by Paul Gilroy was, published in 1993. Since then, there has been even critiques of Paul Gilroy, or people who have moved away from Gilroy and say, I don't read Gilroy, I don't like him. There are other voices to be heard. So here we are fighting about, about scholarly works that are not even up to date. Right? There have been critiques of intersectionality. And so I think that this delay, in time has to do with the availability of the works and the various languages that are being spoken within this diaspora. Another example that I could give is that as a specialist of the African diaspora of the the Atlantic world, but initially as a trained Anglicist, I was only knowledgeable of things published and circulating in French and in English. But what do you make? How can you do Africana studies if you leave out Brazil? If you leave Brazil out of the equation, when we know that Brazil is the single country that received almost half of the entire, of the total amount of the enslaved Africans that were displaced from the African continent to the Americas. Brazil alone received, I think, 47%. And in Brazil, Portuguese, obviously, is spoken. And I don't speak Portuguese. And I don't read things in Portuguese. And it took me a long time to go to Brazil and discover Brazil. And it was like, oh my God, how can you leave out Brazil, out of this equation? So these are the questions. So I think that if I've understood you well, I think that the issue of translation is really to go back to Brent Hayes Edwards, title. It's diaspora is a practice. Translation is a practice. If we think of Négritude and the Paulette and Jeanne Nardal, they were bilingual in English, and they would translate the works of artists of the Harlem Renaissance into French. That's what they did systematically. And this is what they discussed, among other works, of course, during the salon that they were holding in their home. So that the translation as a diasporic practice is key. We need multiple languages. We need multiple, because languages carrying, worldviews to understand people, to understand cultures. We need to be able to speak the language, or to rely on people who speak the language, so that we can have access to those other realities.
I have a related sort of question, and maybe sort of asking you to elaborate. I mean, you also have experience sort of teaching across and working across multiple sort of infrastructures and institutions. And I think within that, in part, what I'm wondering about in relation to translation was, I was just reading something about the 1958 Afro-Asian conference, and one of their recommendations was that all countries that are kind of part of this kind of agreement should try to unify, for example, education curricula, and that kind of question. And so I feel like, though it is interesting, though, historically, to see this moment in the late 50s and early and throughout the 60s, there's so much more sort of expressed sort of solidarity, like in the sort of decolonial project, between whether that is kind of like the sort of like Black and sort of African American question and like what is going on in the sort of like movements of decolonization in the Afro-Asian world. And I feel from where I stand, as an Egyptian scholar person, these things I'm only becoming sentient to the Black question now, having been in the United States for a number of years. Meaning to say that for me, this, even though I'm kind of coming from the continent, some of this was kind of felt a bit like a blind spot, even though it's a question that is being asked. And I guess this disparity, this loosening, how can one create like an infrastructure? Because these infrastructures are also, when we say we need translation and we need multiple languages, is also we need capital. Like, how do we create infrastructures along, again, like sort of solidarities of the global South? How do I create solidarities between, like Egypt and Brazil, but also, again, like not bypassing the kind of oceanic world, like there's so many places and so many that are completely, that have become increasingly disconnected over time, even though once they actually shared the same sort of urgencies, and in a way we do still share the same urgencies. So I guess to maybe speak about, if you could just reflect on this matter of infrastructure in relation to translation.
No, I think that this is a very deep question and a very complicated question, because I'm not that practical. I'm not a doer, but I think that there are two options to foster those solidarities and to develop and nurture them. You can either do it, I think, within or without the institutions. So either you or we penetrate the institutions, we try to transform them, and we try to establish exchanges within the existing institutions, or we create parallel networks of people who get together. But the main issue will remain the same, is the sustainability of those networks. How do we sustain them? How do we get the funds? How do we get the logistics? How do we get the sites? Or where do people meet? How do people meet? How do people travel? What about the taking into account of the visa restrictions based on nationality? There's a whole a geopolitical question around this. Some people can travel easily, some people cannot travel easily. The emergence of Zoom meetings, is it going to help us in that regard? Even though we are, some of us are dying because of Zoom meetings, but perhaps these virtual meetings are going to go over the travel restrictions and everything that is linked to visas, applications, and denials. I think that, again, the question of language is also tied to the question of institutionalization, because how do you become a translator, and how do you become a trained professional translator? If you are only recognized by the certification, if you are classically trained as a translator, what are you trained in? What kind of, like if you're doing, I don't know, books and articles, written translation, what will constitute the curriculum of your training? And will that curriculum help you train you into being able to translate things from Egypt, or things from Brazil, things from Jamaica or Nigeria, or the things that are not, the languages that are associated with populations that are already marginalized. You study the powerful, you study the established, not the margins. So I think that it takes us back to my initial point. Do we want to do those things within or without the institution? If we want to do it within the institution, then we have to transform and rethink all the the academic disciplines. What does it mean to say, I'm a historian, or I'm an anthropologist, or I'm a specialist in literature, or I do economics, or I do sciences? There's got to be more transversal teaching and curricula for sure. So it's really rebuilding and rethinking everything. If we decide to do it outside of academia, then we can just dream and imagine, and we're supposed to be free, absolutely free. So, but there are going to be practical issues. I don't know if I understood you well, and
yes, it's a good start. Thank you. I'll have her over to Edward.
Yeah, I have two questions for you. One is a follow-up regarding what Sarah had brought in terms of sort of inhabiting different infrastructures and perhaps engaging with pedagogy in different institutions and infrastructures. And the second is from Vivian Zihir, who is tuning in via the English translation. So I'm going to be posing you both questions. Well, mine is mostly related also to your work in prisons. I think in a context in which most pedagogical missions that take place in prisons in France are mostly an extension of the war on terror logic of trying to de-radicalize inmates. I think it would be important for our audiences to hear how you go about pedagogy and radical pedagogy, mostly in prisons. And Vivian's question is, with regard to your return from an exile from the French language, were there particular shifts within the Francosphere that prompted this renegotiation? For example, the rise of certain discourses or landmark events?
Okay. Thank you. So I'm going to begin with the first question and the work in prison. How can you be radical in prison? I don't know. I don't know how radical you can be. The issue when you go and you have access to inmates and incarcerated people is to first to be able to stay and to be able to work with this population on the long term. So there is a lot of surveillance. And there is, I don't know, there's not much room for radicalism, I would say. What I've done in France, because my experience in the United States and in France, the two experiences are very different. In the US, I would work over the course of a semester. In France, it was only through, workshops that would last between, let's say, 2 or 3 days up to a week. So if you go in for 2 days and up to a week, this is simply like a one-shot thing. You try to drive a point. You have, you select topics. If you're going to screen movies, you select the movies. If you're gonna use music, if you're gonna use writing, you select a topic. You can try to play with things abstract, right? I remember, one workshop that I did with 2 other people, and we decided to work around the issue of traces, right? Traces. What remains? What has not totally disappeared? What has left traces? In memory, in experience, in whatever way you want to present yourself in the present. And from that very abstract notion that didn't scare anyone, we were able to have, inmates' rights. They were supposed to rhyme, to do rap music, and they told autobiographies. It was very interesting. Autobiographies. So the goal within this week was to have them reflect on their past, on their present, and perhaps imagine a future on this notion of traces. And to us, it was very, it was radical. It was at least an encouragement to have this inmate population reflect on I should say simply reflect. Take the time. They were, they had to enroll in this program. So those who were there, they had chosen to be there, and they had chosen to take time to think and time to transform their thoughts so as to produce something, and to express things not solely directly. There was room for subtlety, and that sometimes I don't think that radicalism is not always the most obvious thing. Things can be deemed radical, but there are different degrees of radical. I mean, not different degrees, but different ways to be radical. So that's my experience in France, but in the United States, because I was teaching over the course of a semester, I taught Africana things, Africana cultures and history. And I always remember the points during the semester when it was women inmates who would say, we are the present day slaves. There was always this point, this moment over the semester when somebody would say, we work for 25 cents an hour, or, all those things. We are being overcharged to use the public phones and everything. So we are the slaves. And this led to very interesting questions. And I think that what I would identify as the most radical thing to pass on to them was each time one of the inmates would say, I know exactly why I ended up here, and I'm going to try to do everything in my power to never come back once I get released. So they did get, things from the readings and from the class discussions. But all that I've said is that you have to balance what you want to share with the population that is incarcerated and the surveillance of the institution, which of course is about controlling your discourse, controlling your pedagogy, controlling the topics, and yes, you have to play with that and to go around that. So I don't know if that was really what you had in mind, Edwin. And regarding the second question around, I don't know, key moments that would have prompted me to
have allowed you to renegotiate a relationship to the Francosphere and perhaps allowed you to return from the US to invest your intellectual labor in France?
I don't know how to answer that. It's, I don't know, it's a combination of, let's say, personal and yes, perhaps public and political elements. It's a lot about guilt. It was guilt. When I was in the US, when I went to the US, everything was so much easier and better and, I don't know, greater and more interesting and more stimulating, and everything seemed freer. But because of my personal background, because of personal issues, I always felt that I owed something to the people who are still in France, that I couldn't be on eternal vacation in the United States and forget, the people who had grown up like me. So for a long time, guilt was a major issue. Like I had something to do. But time passing, I've grown more selfish, and I also feel that I've done a lot. So when I have an opportunity, I go, I leave again, and then I come back because I cannot, because this country is very tiring. The country of France is, it paralyzes you. It makes you freeze. It makes everything difficult. We're having debates that are so tiresome, that are so outdated, that are incredibly, like they make you waste your time and energy. So I'm here, but whenever I can, I go. I need breaks because the people who talk the most or who have the, I don't know, the larger share of power today, they are so backward. It's frustrating, and it's they're so behind. That's all. So what kind of conversations can you have with people? It's a constant struggle. It's not an intellectual stimulation. It's a very raw very, basic political confrontation, nothing else. And people want to appear as if they were thinking and we're having intellectual debates. We're not having intellectual debates. We're having basic political debates, And there's not much room for thought, real thought. And because we spoke about translation earlier, just because people are catching up on certain theories, on certain thinkers, they want to have debates today about issues that some of us have already dealt with. I'm not here to talk about the Black Atlantic. Like, I was a graduate student when I read the Black Atlantic. This is not new. So yes, I don't know if I don't know if I'm answering the questions, but I'm answering the questions the way I understand them.
You're answering the question, but also you're also presenting us with more questions, but also a call to understand that, yes, this is, I think, for us a beginning. And while it is a struggle, you're also kind of inviting us into sort of, again, a space of thinking. So you're creating space, and for that, we thank you. And I hope you do come visit us in the US soon when you need a break.
I'm dying to come back. I'm dying.
All right. Thank you very, very much for your time, for your lecture, for your thoughts. I thank everybody on the technical team, Musée du Quai Branly, Edwin, myself, and the audience. And we'll be on again in 30 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation, Sarah and Edwin, and thank you, the Quai Branly.
Thank you.